Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Section 508 Refresh, Understanding the New Requirements webinar. My name is Kevin Hauer, and I'm with IAAP. Sharon Spencer is also joining us today. Before we start, I wanted to review a few quick things with you. Everyone should already be logged into Adobe Connect, or you can follow along with the presentation provided and over the phone. To access the presentation, there's a handout link in the confirmation email that you received when you registered for the webinar. During the session today, if you want to ask questions, we do have a planned question and answer session at the end, but you can also ask questions throughout the session in the chat window. Or if you are unable to use the chat window, just please let us know and we will be able to unmute you. You can let us know by email. We will monitor that throughout the session as well. To guard against background noise, we do have everyone on mute. At the end of the webinar, if there is time, please feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. To do that, you can just press #6 on your phone to ask your question, and then once you're done, *6 will put you back on mute. If you're hearing the audio over both your computer speakers and the phone, you can either hang up the phone and listen just via the computer, or you can mute the computer as well. Throughout the presentation today, Tim will be using a slideshow, and there is a full screen option to allow you to see that better. Selecting the option again gets you out of full screen mode and back to the normal view. So thank you again for joining us for today's session on the Section 508 Refresh, Understanding the New Requirements. Our speaker today is Tim Springer. Mr. Springer is the co-founder and CEO of SSB BART Group. He has dedicated nearly 2 decades to ensuring that technology will not only meet regulatory standards, but also supports real-world use by individuals with disabilities. As a leader in the digital accessibility industry, Tim has provided client solutions to thousands of organizations, as well as advised large corporations and federal agencies on technical challenges and best practices required to successfully achieve accessibility, including the Social Security Administration, Hewlett-Packard, and Wells Fargo Bank. As the creator and designer of SSB's core technology, Tim led the development of InFocus, the industry's first commercial software for testing web accessibility. We are delighted to have Tim with us today. I think it's going to be a great presentation. So thank you for doing this webinar for us, and I will turn things over to you.
For sure. So thanks, Kevin. So we're actually going to try to start off with a poll. So we're going to attempt to execute a poll here. And just wanted to get some quick feedback from all of you that are participating. Kind of just getting a sense of what organization that you're working for. And if you just go ahead and click on there, we'll go ahead and update it. And if any of those do not match the organization that you are working for, just go ahead and type into the chat, where do you work and what kind of organization do you work for? And just be kind of curious to learn a little bit more about that. So it looks like we've got a split between state and local government, and then a little bit of software, and then a little bit of other, which is pretty good. So cool. All right. Oh, I love it. It's always fun to watch the data on these move live and see where things go. So that's probably good enough. So let me know if you have any specific concerns for your organization in terms of stuff that you want to hear about. What we'll do for questions as well is, as we go, type your questions into the chat. Kevin will collect all of those questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll feed those back at the end and answer them. If we do see some stuff that we can answer as we go, we'll go from there. So Kevin, if you bounce us back to slides, I shall move things forward.
Sure. And Tim, before we go any further, we are getting some comments that you're a little bit quiet. Is there any chance you can be a little closer to your mic or adjust your volume?
You can try that. That's about as good as I will get it, but does that help at all? And if not, we can always try some sort of different approach here too. But does that work?
Laura and Don, is that any better for you?
Better, not much, barely. Yeah, we don't have too many other ways, I think, to change the volume on this. but I could try. Yeah, I don't really have too many other ways to turn up the gain. You may be able to try that on the volume selection, I suppose. The other option I have is I can always try dialing in on another line if it just doesn't work. So, or you can try turning up your volume. I like that. That approach is always good, Sharon, so that works as well. So I'll kind of go on unless, Kevin, it sounds like we're not quite there from a volume perspective, but I'll just sort of go through and then hit me back. Let me know if you want me to change anything. So we actually already talked about me. I'm not that interesting anyways. So I've been in the business of digital accessibility for about 20 years at this point. I go way back in the day. I actually go back before the initial Section 508 regs came out, and then now actually digging into the new revised 508 regulations. Also, you may see us talk a little bit about this random thing called level access. The company that I work for is SSB BART Group. We are in the process of a rebranding and a new corporate identity, and so our target identity is going to be level access. And the reason for that is that SSB BART Group, not the best name for a company. So we went through a whole rebranding process, and so if you see level access out there, no, it is the same organization that used to be known as or formerly known as SSB BART Group. And nothing really changes in terms of delivery and efficacy on that. Just a cooler name and a fun chance to kind of rebrand everything. So what are we trying to accomplish today? What do we want to do? Big picture, we're trying to just flesh out the key differences between where the current Section 508 requirements are and where we're going to end up with the revised 508 standards, give you a sense of when that all happens and what the impact is on the timeline perspective, and then finally understand how do you start to validate and test around that, right? So how do I make sure that I have, in fact, effectively implemented the updated 508 standards? Sorry, we skipped one slide there. And so that's kind of the goals of the session. And then in terms of the stuff that we'll actually cover, give you a little background on Section 508, define some common standards, define some common ideas associated with that, mostly dig into the key differences. So what changes between the current 508 standards and the revised 508 standards? When does this go down? Like, what are the dates that I care about? What's relevant? And then structurally, what do the new standards look like? So how do I navigate these new standards, and what does that mean in terms of interpreting and applying them, particularly to information communication technology? And then we'll wrap up with a little bit on, okay, great, I get it, I have to do it. How do I actually test and validate that? And also, how do I do monitoring at a production level? So just to give you a little background on Section 508. So Section 508 is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. The Rehabilitation Act, and particularly federal, Section 508 of that is a U.S. federal law, so it only applies to the U.S. federal government, does not directly apply to state and local governments, but is often conformed to by state and local governments as a best practice. And basically what 508 says is, if it is electronic and information technology that is developed, purchased, used, or maintained by the federal government, it needs to be accessible and usable to people with disabilities. You'll also hear the term information and communication technology thrown around. That is the new term of art that you will see generally used. So the old one is EIT, the new one is ICT, and ICT is a little more reflective of the scope of the 508 standards and actually the scope of digital accessibility in general. One thing you may want to do at some point, and I actually always recommend this when you're dealing with regulations, you can actually go check out the language of the law. If you look at Section 29 of the United States Code, subsection 794D, we provided a link there. You can actually go out and look at the law. Sometimes it's actually really useful to read the actual language of the law. Section 508 is actually based on amendments to the Rehabilitation Act, and they passed in 1998 as part of the Workforce Investment Act. The Rehabilitation Act is actually really interesting. It's actually the first law of its kind on a global basis. It was actually signed into law back in 1973. A lot of amendments to that since then. And it's really a landmark law that enshrines anti-discrimination rights for people with disabilities. And you can actually see that law if you want to go read that as well in 29 U.S.C. 701. But in particular, what was really neat is Section 504, which actually came before 508, applied to all federally funded programs. And so it basically said, hey, anything the federal government spends money on, if it's a program administered by the federal government, is covered by these anti-discrimination laws. And you'll actually see a big effect in federally funded programs from Section 504 to this day. So just to be aware of that, so 508 applies to the U.S. federal government. 504, though, applies to anything the U.S. federal government funds. The way that then works in the Section 508 world, though, is basically 508 is the law. The law is then given to the U.S. Access Board. The Access Board then has the authority to create standards for that law, which then govern how that law is implemented. And so that's the idea, is essentially that those standards have then gone into place, and that's what's being propagated now. There are some states that have slightly different laws than Section 508, but a lot of times what we see is similar laws. We have seen some states that have adopted slightly more aggressive requirements and technical standards in the past. Particularly, some states have moved to WCAG 2.0, AA as kind of the default technical standard, and so the federal government with the new revised Section 508 regulations has kind of caught up with that. So that's just kind of a quick background on Section 508. Moving on from there, then the next question is, great, what is actually covered under this? And at the biggest level, I would tell you anything that has ones and zeros going through it is pretty much covered. If it's got any sort of digital aspect to it, it's probably going to be covered. There's a little more that's covered outside of that as well in terms of analog, but pretty much everything is digital at this point, so that seems to be an easy way to boil it down. The regulatory language there says it includes any information technology, any equipment or interconnected system or subsystem that is used in the creation, conversion, or duplication of data or information, right, which is a heck of a mouthful. Examples of that, though, make more sense, right? So if it's a communication product, if it is a telephone, if it is a mobile phone, if it is an email system or interface, right, those are going to be covered. If it is a physical standalone information system like a kiosk or an information display or a ticketing system, those are going to be covered. If it's a website, if it's electronic documents you post online, if it's video and media you post online, that's covered. Ditto for then physical hardware like laptops, office equipment, copy machines, etc. It's interesting to note here, ICT coverage under 508 covers both employee-facing information and communication technology as well as public-facing. There is not a difference from the perspective of 508. It's whatever the U.S. federal government spends money on, that is essentially covered. And again, big picture, what's covered? If it's got ones and zeros running through it, I would tell you it's probably covered. So from a regulatory history standpoint, the revised 508 standards were issued in January of this year, rough and ready about 2 months ago. That is the culmination of about a 10-year process. So as of the initial 508 standards are issued way the heck back in 2000, they go into effect in 2001. And there's this process by which then the Access Board about 6 years later says, hey, we should start looking at updating and revising these standards. And so the Access Board goes through a research process to make the initial recommendations. They then go through two what are called ANPRMs, Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which is basically when a U.S. federal government agency says, hey, we're thinking about making a regulation. It could potentially look like this. Give us some comments on that. So the Access Board puts out two of those in 2010, 2011, gets a ton of feedback from the public, and then spends the next couple years revising, finalizing, getting an NPRM in place. The NPRM comes out, to make the numbers easy, about a year and a half ago, and then the final rule is then issued earlier this year, essentially. And the rule is published around the 9th publicly, but actually then goes into place in terms of the actual Federal Register about January 18th, after it then gets reviewed and approved by the board as a whole. And we'll talk about implementation timeline Really, the easiest number to remember, and what I'd encourage you to remember, is 1 year from the date of publication in the Federal Register. So January 18th, 2018, that's basically when the revised 508 standards go into effect. And there are some other dates in there, and they're sort of interesting from a social studies perspective. But if you really boil it down, January 18th, 2018 is the date you should be concerned about or sort of think about as you look at these things. So let's talk about some key differences between the current Section 508 standards and then the target Section 508 standards, or the revised 508 standards. So at the absolute highest level, the change is to move from a focus purely on technical standards, move a focus to technical standards from functional standards. So basically take away as much subjectivity in the application of the standards as possible. And so the initial 508 standards, or the current 508 standards, had a bunch of functional performance criteria in them. And essentially the functional performance criteria have always been this like tricky thing to apply, and people weren't really sure when they apply. Do they apply all of the time? Do they not apply? So there's a lot of clarity about when they apply in the revised 508 standards. And basically they only apply when the technical standards do not apply. And so you have a very clear differentiation between here's what you have to do technically, and if you have a standard that's covered, you have a good sort of safe harbor protection, if you will, for conforming to the standards. If those technical standards don't apply, then the functional standards apply. In addition, the functional standards became a lot clearer in terms of the functional performance criteria. So when they actually apply is more relevant. But in addition, then they've been expanded out a little bit. In particular, have some coverage for cognitive use, use by people with cognitive disabilities, which is kind of a really interesting space that we've seen come up. So that's sort of one, is clarification on that, and it's really a movement towards structured technical standards being used to determine conformance versus something that really has more subjectivity to it and judgment. The second big change that we see is basically moving to what is called a product-based approach versus an approach based on sort of ICT implementation or the way something is built out. So the idea behind the product-based approach is you'll look at the big picture structure of the standards, and it's basically split out into things that relate to hardware, software, content, and support services. And so the idea behind that is essentially, instead of saying we're going to dictate that anything that is implemented via the web has to conform to specific web standards, anything implemented via software has to conform to these specific software standards. Essentially what they say is, hey, look, if the thing does a function like this, it has to conform to this set of requirements. So an example of that is like a mobile phone. So like the smartphone that I have doesn't like clearly look like a phone. It doesn't clearly look like software. It doesn't clearly look exactly like hardware. It's the combination of all of those things. In addition, it has some supporting services that go into the experience of the whole thing. And so basically what the revised standards say is, you got to look at all of the pieces that are relevant and conform with all of those. So like the aspects of the phone that have to do with hardware have to conform to the hardware standard. The aspects of the phone that have to do with software have to conform to the software standard. The aspects of the phone that have to do with documentation have to conform to the documentation standard. And like holistically, that sort of makes sense, but doing that under the current standards, you can get there, but it's a bit of a mess. It's a bit challenging, so it's a lot easier to do under these standards. In addition, there is this idea of sort of safe harbor if you conform with the technical implementation and the limitation of these functional performance criteria. And so we discussed that earlier, but the idea that basically if you implement it in a way that conforms technically with particular standards, and you can demonstrate that that's all you have to do. You don't then have to prove that it's actually functionally usable by individuals with disabilities. I would tell you in practice, there's really not much difference though. It's very, very unlikely you would have something that technically conforms that could not be used by a person with disabilities. Going the other way, it actually is quite likely you would have stuff that could be used by people with disabilities but may not technically conform, interestingly enough. And there's some exceptions to that, but broadly speaking, that's a good rule of thumb. The next couple ones we'll actually jump into in a little more depth, so I won't dig into them too much at this point. Broad use of consensus-based standards, that's aligning the U.S. with standards that are used globally. Clear coverage for electronic content, when and how particularly electronic documents are covered. What's the impact of that? A related component of that is clear coverage for authoring tools. If you create documents or content, make sure that they support the creation of accessible content. Make sure that things work properly with assistive technology when and as that's appropriate. And then generally really just bring the standards up to date with the modern era, right? When you have really technical standards that are 17 years old, as you can imagine, they're a little bit out of date in some areas. A couple of the points we didn't note here, as I mentioned before, added some cognitive coverage into functional performance criteria, which is pretty neat. That's a new area in accessibility. We're delighted to see that. Also included some coverage for what is called real-time text. If you're familiar with real-time text, it's the best example of this is like on your phone when you're texting other people. That's real-time text, and you can actually see things as people type it in some scenarios. And so it turns out that that's a really good text-based communication structure, and it's much better, particularly in telecommunications, than the old TTY, TDD, BODOP standards. So good stuff to get on that. There's some other changes that are then kind of minor that relate to hardware changes and software documentation as well. So let's talk real quickly about harmonization of standards and what that means. So if you are a standards weenie, for lack of a better term, if you're someone that likes standards, you will hear the term harmonization thrown around a lot. Harmonization doesn't mean anything more complicated than instead of writing a bunch of different standards, let's write one sort of major standard. And then if we have to write some other country-specific standards, let's try to make them as close as possible to a common standard. So if we do have different standards for different reasons, let's try to have them be as similar as possible. And the idea there is that the gold standard in technical standards particularly is this concept of voluntary international consensus-based standards. WCAG is kind of a great example of that, which is to say, it's owned, if you will, by an international organization. It's built based on a consensus-driven process from a lot of experts over a long period of time. So there's a lot of buy-in into it. It's been really extensively vetted. And the theory there, which I think is sound, is essentially that standards that come out of that consensus-based process tend to be more robust and tend to have considered lots and lots of corner cases. In addition, because they're broadly used and broadly adopted, they tend to have a really big base of knowledge around them, so there's a lot of people that can help the implementation of that. That in turn then dovetails with this idea that if we have a common accessibility standard on a global basis ideally, but at least across a lot of big markets, we then have a bigger market for accessibility. That if we're implementing, as an example under this, WCAG conformance as kind of the primary standard, if a bunch of different countries align on WCAG as the requirements, it's then a lot easier to get software tooling, consulting, all of the stuff that goes into supporting that. And by and large, that idea, we would tell you, is pretty much correct, that you do, in fact, get more effective solutions, you get better competition in the market, and you avoid a situation where, you know, your individual country is implementing something that is unique to it, and so you end up paying a higher price to do that. In particular, as they were building the revised Section 508 standards, the Access Board very actively coordinated with a bunch of other standards in flight. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Germany, and France are outlined. The really big standard they did a lot of coordination with is a European Union standard. That standard is EN 30154-9. That will be the standard for all European Union public procurement. To oversimplify, that'll go into effect essentially over the next 4 years in Europe, and the laws around that are actually done and passed as well. And so what you end up with at the end of that period is The U.S. public sector procurement is really well aligned with the entire EU public sector procurement, and so you start to get a really, really big market for accessible solutions. And in addition, if you build a product in the U.S. and make it accessible, you can sell it in the European Union and have confidence that it will be accessible, and the claims that you make in one market are then relevant and useful in the other market. There's a sum total of 10 reference standards that are actually in the revised 508 guidelines. The only ones, or excuse me, revised 508 standards, the only one you really will want to worry about for the purpose of this webinar is going to be the WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0 and AA standards. Because you are on an IAAP webinar, I will not take time defining that, as I expect you are all wildly familiar with what the WCAG is. Another thing, that was then built out in the revised 508 standards was very clear and explicit coverage for electronic documents. There's a pretty good argument to be made that electronic documents are in fact covered under the current standards. We would tell you, if you were asking us our expert opinion, that that is in fact the case. But the coverage is really not particularly clear, and some organizations and agencies interpret that differently. And so essentially, the Access Board wanted to just have clear and concise guidance on that that made sense. And so basically where that ends up as is, if it's public-facing content, it is covered. It doesn't matter if it's in a web page or a Word doc or a PDF doc. If you expose it to the public, you should assume that it's covered and you need to make it accessible. In addition, if it is internal-facing and it is what is known as official agency business, that is also covered as well. And so that's basically, they'll kind of define, and I'll run you through what official agency business is, but a formal act of the organization, those are basically all going to be covered. One thing that's interesting is content is really clearly broadly defined, and that is very intentional. So that's not just like your classic public-facing website. That's your website, that's blog, posts that you may put up. If you post stuff over to social media sites, that is potentially covered as well, which gets into some complicated policies and procedures there, and how do you do that. Ditto if you have like outbound emails from your organization. So if you send things out to a mailing list that you maintain as an organization, all that stuff is basically covered. Official content posted on non-agency URLs seems to be covered. The idea there, though, is you can also potentially provide an alternative. The key here is kind of actually with social media sites. So if you post content, as an example, on Facebook, and you can't control the accessibility of the experience on Facebook, which is a reasonable argument, you're still responsible to make sure that content is accessible in some reasonable fashion. But there is an obvious recognition that you can't control Facebook and that that is a means of communication, and so you can then provide alternatives for it. So just from a policy perspective, something to be aware of, and you got to work through that. For non-public facing content, the stuff that falls under that is this idea of official agency communication. Official communications are actually specified in the standard, and they include emergency notifications, any sort of structured decisions relating to an administrative claim or proceeding. That can also be stuff that is not public facing but goes to a particular individual in the public. So that doesn't mean it's doesn't go to someone outside of the agency. It just means it's not to the public as a whole. So anything the public as a whole is covered, but then also any official agency communication with a specific member of the public is covered under these requirements as well. And so again, that can be decisions, that can be program and policy announcements, notices of benefits, program eligibility, employment opportunity or action, formal acknowledgments or receipts, surveys, templates and forms, educational or training materials, and intranet web content. Again, broadly speaking, the best rule of thumb there is if it's some sort of official part of the agency's business, assume that it is covered. Like anything that you do more than once and anything that is documenting sort of any formal transaction between you and a member of the public, while that's not facing the public writ large, that is a sort of a structured and official communication. One final note, there is this exception for archived data that's not publicly available. So if you have like a gigantic database of scanned-in PDF files, or scanned-in content that then is stuck in PDF files, and it's not there for the public to look at it. It's internal-facing only. You have a way, if someone really needs an alternative for it, to request that. Broadly speaking, that stuff is okay not to go back and make accessible. So if you have hundreds of millions of pages of documents that don't actually face any member of the public, assume that's okay. Standards for electronic documents basically also normalize back to WCAG 2.0A and AA. One interesting thing here is authoring tools are also covered as well, and that was kind of a really neat thing that got into the revised Section 508 standards. And so basically what that means is Microsoft Word, as an example, is covered as a piece of software to the extent that the user interface of that software has to conform to the technical standards, but as a way that it actually allows you to create documents, it is also covered. So it has to support the creation of documents that can be produced, saved in a accessible fashion. And so that's kind of a neat idea. As part of that, there is some call out for PDF and options to, instead of conforming to WCAG 2.0A and AA, to essentially conform to PDF UA, which gets you very close to WCAG 2.0A and AA. But the Access Board kind of clear-cut that, didn't end up putting PDF UA in the final specification, and basically just gave people flexibility in terms of that, but ultimately said, hey, look, normalize on WCAG conformance. That's an easier way to go. Interoperability requirements we won't spend a lot of time on. This basically just boils down to the idea that if you implement something, you need to make sure you implement it in a way that conforms to the assistive technology and accessibility features provided by the underlying platforms. You would not have this be applicable in the context of a web app where you're ultimately implementing WCAG 2.0 directly. It really tends to come up in like mobile apps this day and age. Also, if you do like compiled desktop software, it comes up in that as well, but that's actually pretty uncommon for most enterprise deployments. But if you're building a mobile app, essentially what this means is implement the APIs that are relevant to that system. So if you build something that goes onto Apple, implement the Apple accessibility APIs or the iOS accessibility APIs. If you're deploying something on Android, implement the Android accessibility APIs. That would also then apply to mobile hybrid apps, which are a mix of web-based content, which would need to conform to the WCAG, and then native content on the application, which would need to conform to the native operating system API. And again, broadly speaking, the fix here is use the standard operating system application programming interfaces or APIs, and make sure you implement the standard accessibility functions of the platform. There is this concept of safe harbor associated with this as well. And the idea is essentially if you have something that is a piece of information technology that you're using and maintaining and you're updating, right? If you're doing stuff with it, but that stuff that you're doing with it happens before January 18th, 2018, you only fall under the current Section 508 regulations. So you do not have to change something that is currently conforming with the Section 508 regulations unless you go in and make material changes to it. The idea there is that that safe harbor applies on a sort of severable basis to components and elements in the system. And so if you go in and you change, X functionality in the system, but Y functionality is unaffected, if you change X after January 18, 2018, you need to update it to conform to the new standards, but it's okay if Y still conforms to the old standards. Obviously, in practice, that'll be a little bit more complicated than that, but that's basically the idea to update that. Also, if you're doing things that are just under the covers and you're not actually changing the user interface, as an example that was called out by the Access Board, like if you're doing a security patch, it doesn't change any functionality, but you're just patching underlying systems, that does not constitute a change. That's not an alteration of the system. That's a patch, and essentially you can keep it the same. Outside of that, right, if it wasn't compliant before, it doesn't get covered under the safe harbor, right? So there's not a valid argument that it was broken before, therefore it should be allowed to be broken now. It's basically you're still covered under the new standards as well. If it was in development before January 18th, but not yet actually used, release is generally a good milestone there. It doesn't fall under the safe harbor, right? So if you build it all the way up to January 18th, 2018, and you release it on January 19th, you need to build it for the new Section 508 standards. Do not build it for the current Section 508 standards. So just be aware of that. And essentially, there is some flexibility in the actual individual agency level in terms of how they implement this. There are agency-level policies and programs, and we'll give you some theories on where we think that's going to be going. But that's basically out there. So next area that's changed from kind of the current 508 standards to the new 508 standards, documentation and support. Historically, documentation and support was a little bit fluid in terms of what was covered, what was not covered. There was this idea that if you provided alternative formats on request, that was enough. Very clearly now, documentation and support is covered, and your documentation and support needs to conform to WCAG 2.0 A and AA requirements. There are 4 exceptions, 4 success criteria exceptions you get for WCAG under that, one having to do with bypass blocks, multiple ways, consistent identification, and consistent navigation, things that don't apply to single standalone documents. Arguably, most of those don't apply to single standalone documents, and so those are no longer covered. Support is covered under whatever technical implementation it is implemented on. Generally speaking, support is going to be web-based, so that'll be covered under WCAG 2.0 A and AA. And so any system that you provide support for a covered product or for a covered service, that is also then covered as well, right? So if you have a documentation site, if you have a support site that people can go to use, the product, the service, whatever it is, that's then going to be covered as well and covered under WCAG. There is this idea that you can provide alternative formats on request, specifically for individuals in kind of the visual impairment community, people that are blind or people that are low vision. The idea there is that only applies when you can't provide accessible electronic documentation. People can provide alternatives. We would probably tell you to err a little bit on the side of caution there, and we might tell you if people really are asking for alternative formats and there's a reasonable, they pass the reasonable test, to be prepared to provide those as well. But technically speaking, as long as you provide accessible electronic documentation, you're going to be covered. That's just kind of going above and beyond, but we would recommend that. And then the last 2 points are straightforward. Provide an overview of accessibility and compatibility features that is similar to the current U.S. Section 508 regulations, just kind of clarified and scrubbed up a bit, and then support the service, support the communication needs of individuals with disabilities, also a similar requirement. But the big change here is documentation clearly covered, and you have to provide that electronic documentation in an accessible fashion, and that accessible fashion is defined as WCAG 2.0 A and AA conformance. For those of you that are in the private industry, the VPAT will be getting an update. We don't know if we don't know if the government will require the VPAT as it is updated. That's a determination that GSA will have to make in conjunction with the various different federal agencies. The GSA may also opt to use something else. But the IDI will be updating the VPAT that's in beta right now, and so we expect that'll get updated. Something cool the IDI did there is actually normalized it with 508 WCAG and EN 301549, so you can kind of like just do one big report that covers all those standards. So interesting information on that. Also, just be aware, GSA historically has published something called the GPAT, the Government Product Accessibility Template, and the idea behind the GPAT was that was a requirements document that federal government procurement officials could put into their solicitations and then have people report back onto that. And so organizations could report on the GPAT, or they could attach their VPAT, so that'll probably get updated as well as part of that. This is just wild theoretical speculation on our part, but probably fairly reasonable based on what we see. So there is this idea in Section 508 that the agencies will then take the standards and figure out their own implementation and conformance process to those standards. Most agencies that we see essentially have a checklist that they use to validate that things are Section 508 compliant. They then take sort of the standards, they build a checklist from that, and then they may have agency-specific requirements that are also in there from an accessibility perspective to ensure that the technology works in their agency-specific environment, and they have that flexibility under the laws to do that. And so essentially we would expect most of the agencies will just go update the checklists. A lot of the checklists actually already incorporate the updated WCAG 2.0 requirements, so it's not a huge move for a lot of the agencies. The software application of standards is something that's a little tricky right now. So some agencies will look at the current 508 regulations and say the software standards under 1194.21 apply to websites. Some will not. That will get normalized as part of this, where it's very clear that if it provides some sort of functional use in software, it's basically covered and the technical standards are the same. So those will get updated as part of the process. And then the procurement processes will also be updated, and there's a waterfall on that we'll talk about when we get to timeline. It's a good timeline. So in terms of when does this all go into effect? So final rule was approved recently, right? Published in the Federal Register on January 18th. The guidelines go into effect on March 21st. There's a kind of an interesting story there, right? So original effective date of the standards is March 18th, 2017, which is 60 days after the publication in the Federal Register. The White House on January 20th issues a memo, and it's this memorandum to the heads of executive departments. And I think there's a, oh yeah, you can see the title of that, Regulatory Freeze Pending Review. So the White House sends out a memo, and it basically says, hey, look, any in-flight regulation that you have, so any regulation that you've issued but that is not yet effective, reset the effective date to be 60 days from the issuance of this memo. And so essentially that then gets you to this effective date of March 21st. So that's why that moved a couple of days. Not a really big deal, especially because a compliance date is unchanged. And the compliance date is really the date that's actually relevant here. And so you essentially get like a one-day delay in the effective date, but it doesn't actually change any of the dates that are really important, which are basically the date at which you have to switch over to these new procurement regulations and actually make sure that ICT you're building is in fact accessible. Outside of that, just be aware that once the standards were issued, there is a separate process to update the federal acquisition regulation. Generally speaking, that happens 6 months after the issuance of the standards. There's some statutory requirements that it actually happens in that time frame, and so we expect GSA will conform to that. And essentially the way that works is GSA takes the standards that are issued, looks at the FAR and how the FAR is structured and set up, basically digs in with the federal government agencies, and goes through the process of figuring out, hey, how do we actually want to operationalize this from a government procurement perspective? And so you'll see a bunch of updates on section 508.gov, which is the GSA site associated with this. You'll probably see a refresh toolkit there. There's actually a URL in the slides when we send them out. You'll see for section 508.gov/refresh toolkit. That gives you a little bit more insight into that. But again, big picture from a timing perspective, January 18th, 2018, that's the date when all this stuff pretty much goes into effect. So I'll shift quickly into the structure of the standards, and we'll dig in a little bit more into how are these things put together, and then a little bit more depth on how the components apply, and then finish up with a little bit on testing. So historically, you would have seen the entire standards under 36 CFR 1194, .1, .21, .22, .23, .31, et cetera. 36 is the section of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is CFR. 1194 is the subsection, and then .1 is sort of the subsection of the subsection, essentially. And so you'll see that regulatory structure commonly used in U.S. regulations, which is the overall portion of the CFR and then individual components of the CFR from there. So the way that this works is 36 CFR 1194-1 contains the standards for Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. All that does is it then references Appendix A, C, and D of 36 CFR 1194-1. So all of the meat is now in these appendices. And then the appendices map to various different components of them. And there's a couple structural reasons for that, but basically structurally that now mimics other standards that are issued by the Access Board. And so structurally that made more sense for the Access Board and just kind of keeping a standardized playing field. There's also some considerations with these particular standards in that they're intermixed with a bunch of recommendations the Access Board makes on the implementation of another act, Section 255 of the Communications Act, or Telecommunications Act, if you like. And so there's a reason that they're all sort of stuck together like that. But super big picture, if you look at that appendix in Appendix A covers two big things on Section 508. One is application and administration, which is basically like, how do you actually apply this to stuff? And then the big one is scoping and requirements, which is what individual components are then, how do the individual components of the product relate to the technical standards that then come under Appendix C and Appendix D. You will see, if you look at those standards, paragraphs that have E in front of them relate to Section 508. If you were to look at Appendix A to the standards for the Section 255, you would see paragraphs C. So throughout this, you may see E paragraphs and C paragraphs. If you see E paragraphs, you care about that for 508. If you see C paragraphs, it has to do with 255, and you can safely ignore it. So Appendix A, that's what applies. Appendix C then is just all of the actual rules or all of the actual standards that are then relevant. And the rules and standards are broken down into these sort of 5 big categories. So Chapter 3 has to do with these functional performance criteria. And the functional performance criteria dictate various different user modes and require that those user modes be available to individuals with disabilities. And the user modes are ensure that it works for someone that does not have vision, ensure that it works for someone that has low vision, so on and so forth. And there's a little more definition to it, but basically that's how functional performance criteria work. You basically say, here are types of users that you need to make sure things work for, and then the vendor or developer is required to then sort of demonstrate that those use cases are valid. The biggest chapter here is actually for hardware, and the reason for that is that hardware is a proprietary standard. And so we'll walk you through some of those requirements later on, but that's actually why hardware is significant, because that's a big sort of, all of the standard language is there. It's not actually maps to any publicly available standard. So lots of stuff on hardware. Software, support documentation, and reference standards, actually all relatively short. And the reason for those being short is they essentially just reference third-party standards and basically dictate some really high-level guidance. So then the way that you can kind of think of this at a really big picture perspective is you've got 2 optional sets of requirements. So one set of requirements are the technical requirements, and basically that's your primary method of determining compliance. And the technical requirements are essentially coding or development requirements. And if you go through those, they're big checklists, and if you check off all the items in the checklist, you essentially are compliant with those technical standards. And so the technical standards, as we mentioned before, give you this sort of safe harbor approach. And you can say, hey, look, I conform to WCAG, therefore I conform to the Section 508 requirements as a whole. Historically, that would have been a difficult claim to make. Now that's a really easy claim to make, right? And in practice, that also then makes this a lot easier to say, do you conform to the standards? Yes, I conform to the standards because the relevant technical requirements are, WCAG 2.0 A and AA, And here is my WCAG support statements that demonstrates how I conform to that. There is still this concept of functional standards, and the idea is the functional standards only apply when you can't find a technical requirement that is relevant or applicable, where there's some technical requirement, but it doesn't really make sense. And so those standards have then been extended and tweaked a little bit to provide some clarity. But again, they only apply in cases where the technical requirements don't. So we'll jump through then those requirements real quick and then finish up with a little talk on testing. So hardware requirements, this is like physical stuff. So if it's a computer, a multifunction copier machine, a keyboard, a phone, whatever it is, anything physical that displays, the requirements then relate to speech output, provide a means for it to provide speech output, control volume, and the list goes on from there. I won't read it out. But this is physical devices and the requirements for physical devices. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned before, this is the biggest technical standard, and that's because this is a proprietary standard versus having a consensus standard that's referenced. This standard, however, does harmonize pretty well with the European Union standards for hardware, so you get a lot of good similarities there, and kind of that combination will probably pretty much be the default we expect to see going forward. Software requirements. Software is really broadly defined, and so software defined as programs, procedures, rules, and related data and documentation that direct the use and operation of ICT and instruct it to perform a given task or function. Software includes, but is not limited to, applications, non-web software, implying that software, web-based software is also covered, and then platform-based software. I've never really totally understood exactly what that definition means, but basically, I think software is pretty much any sort of interactive thing, anything that you can actually use in a meaningful fashion, all the way from base level interactions on a website, all the way up to kind of like full sort of desktop software experience. The biggest punchline here is that web software is covered very clearly, and it's covered under WCAG 2.0 Level A. And so essentially what that means is you have to conform to the Level A and AA success criteria, and you have to conform to the conformance requirements under WCAG. And that's actually a pretty high bar in terms of implementing those components. So we expect AA success criteria are good, conformance requirements, we may have some time to dig into those later on, but not tons and tons. Native software essentially complies to the WCAG 2.0 requirements as well. And so if you have a if you have a desktop application, if you have a mobile phone application, those will basically also be required to conform. And essentially the way that that works is you can either use dead reckoning or you can use something called WCAG 2 ICT, which is essentially a standard that documents how you take WCAG and apply it to non-web types of technology. How do you apply that standard? Broadly speaking, though, what we would tell you is start with sort of the core platform accessibility implementations and make sure that you fully support that. Make sure you have support for this concept of non-disruption. Make sure it works in assistive technology. And then finally support for a couple other things, user settings of color, contrast, font type, font size, and focus cursor, and dig into that. But pretty much, if it is a piece of software, it's got to conform to WCAG 2.0. The only real question is how exactly does that conform in specific cases. KG had a question, do the software requirements apply to firmware? The answer to that is yes. In terms of the actual implementability of that, you may have some challenges implementing that if you're like at a really low level on the device. And if that low level on the device is only used, if it's used infrequently and only used for setup, you may have some other approaches you take from a compliance perspective in justifying that compliance. But that's like actually a pretty legitimately complicated question in terms of the exact strategy to do it. But broadly speaking, yes is the answer. It definitely applies. The question then is, how do you go about that application, and is it something you want to claim full conformance with, or do you want to sort of try to justify some exceptions to that? So that's kind of the concept behind software. Support and documentation, pretty much what you would think support and documentation is. It's any of the stuff that wraps around the system or solution that goes into using it. So it's product documentation, it's supporting content and documentation, it's help desk support services if people call in. Those are pretty much all covered. Broadly speaking, if it's in an electronic content format, you use WCAG 2.0. If you're providing it in some non-electronic formats, you provide alternatives on request, right? So if you really only provide printed copies of something, you don't have to now provide electronic copies of something, but you have to be prepared to provide alternatives. If you provide electronic copies of it, the electronic copies you provide need to be accessible. And broadly speaking, accessible is WCAG 2.0 conformant. And there is this idea that I mentioned earlier that if you provide it in a electronic format, that is a good enough approach, that you don't then have to also provide alternatives if it's, provided in accessible electronic format. Examples we had talked about, right? Help desk, call centers, training, we would also probably tell you is covered in there as well. That's one that can get a couple people, and we've seen that, but that's pretty clearly covered at this point as well. And really anything that you're providing information to the public, also be aware you do have to provide what we think of as sort of accessibility README files, but those are overviews of the accessibility features and compatibility features of the system that you provide, information technology. So final kind of dig in on this, we'll just dig into the technical standards in a little bit more depth, right? So again, I'm going to assume everyone here is familiar with, potentially painfully familiar with WCAG 2.0 AA. I'll give you just some quick overview of the differences on that to dig into that between the current and the target 508 standards. If you want, there's a link that we'll provide there and in the slides to the actual detailed version of that. And the access board actually goes into that in a little bit more depth, but we've kind of taken the stance that most people are probably aware of the target there. And so we'll just call out a couple of big differences. So one is this concept of flashing. The old concept of flashing in the 1194.22 regs, the current Section 508 regs, allowed flashing at sort of high ranges and allowed it sort of twice per second. The new flashing standard here is if it's 3 times per second or more, and or it's in a small area, those are sort of your limits, right? So if it flashes more than 3 times per second, you can't do it. You can't allow flashing in a small area of the screen. But practically, none of this is really going to change things, but it's worth noting as a minor change. There is a lot more flexibility on this concept of readability of a document without style sheets. I can get into the history there, but it is super boring and not worth discussing. Basically, the current 508 standards say a page has to work without style sheets. The WCAG requirement is basically, hey, look, you can use style sheets all you want. It just has to ensure that the content is in a meaningful sequence. And there's sort of a slightly more subtle requirement there that anything, any information provided by the style sheet also has to be provided in the document itself. I would tell you that's arguably in the current 508 standards as well, so that's not a change, but just kind of a little color on that. So that gives you a lot more flexibility. You can use style sheets. You can kind of use them at whatever level that you want, which works pretty well. There's also this concept in the current 508 standards that if you embed content that is not HTML, you have to provide a link to a plugin. And in the WCAG standards, it's a little more fluid there. Essentially, it's you can use technology. You got to just make sure that the technology, in fact, is accessible, right? So, like, you can use whatever you want. From a plugin perspective, you don't have to provide a link to it on the page itself, but you do have to do the actual work to make sure the technology you're using is accessible. So you may just have more flexibility there, right? The sort of requirement that you have a link to download a PDF player on every page is a little absurd, so you don't have to do that anymore. You may still want to do that systemically on the site, but there isn't a requirement to do that. The current sort of approach in 508 says, hey, look, you can't use alternative pages unless you can prove that the primary page can't be made accessible. WCAG has a little bit different approach to that. It allows for alternative to pages to be used, but you have to make sure that there's equivalence between it. So you don't have to pass the test of, I can't make the primary page accessible. You can provide an alternative, but there are a whole bunch more rules in sort of what a valid alternative is in the world of WCAG. So it gives you more flexibility, but also gives a lot more sort of validation of that alternative approach. And then the final one is this concept of meaningfulness of link text. A lot of federal government agencies we've seen require that link text is meaningful when taken out of context. That is not a 508 requirement, but that is an operational requirement we've seen from agencies. What that means is if you're like tabbing through a document and you're listening in assistive technology, particularly in a screen reader, that when you hear each individual link, it makes sense as you just hear each link. You don't have to have surrounding content or context. WCAG is looser on that. It essentially says, hey, look, the links have to make sense only in context. It doesn't have to make sense if you take them out of context. We would tell you that's probably a slightly more reasonable approach, but it's still a best practice to make sure that the links make sense out of context. It's just a WCAG AAA requirement. So that's just something we expect agencies will determine on a case-by-case basis. And be aware, as I mentioned before, agencies have every right and ability to do that, both under 508 standards as well as under just kind of core public procurement law, which is to say Agency 1 could require more accessibility of you than Agency 2, and that is a totally valid and legitimate approach. Be aware that WCAG 2.1 may actually apply at some point in the future. There's a lot of work to get there, so that's not happening anytime soon. But the first public working draft of that was actually just published about 3 weeks ago. There's a bunch of cool new success criteria. I don't know, I'm probably the only person that would say they are cool new success criteria. But lots of neat stuff there. A lot of work on mobile. A lot of work on low vision, a lot of work on cognitive. Mobile in particular could use a good bit of work under WCAG, so 2.1 gives that. What's interesting about this too is with this revised 508 standard, it is now a lot easier for the board to update the reference standard. So instead of the board having to go back and do this massive regulatory process, they can actually just issue an administrative approach and basically say, hey, look, we're updating WCAG references in 508 to now point to WCAG 2.1. And so in keeping pace with those changes, it'll be a much, much easier approach for the Access Board. So we'd actually be delighted to see that. We think that'll really help. And there's a lot of cool stuff in WCAG 2.1 that'll push it forward. A couple other points on WCAG, really just digging into kind of conformance and then functional requirements, right? So for electronic content, for web, for software, for documents, everything ends up getting normalized to WCAG. And so that was a very active decision on the part of the Access Board, and we would tell you that was a very good decision. As part of that, though, be aware that the WCAG conformance requirements now come into scope. And those include things like sort of compliance level approach, which basically determining the full set of compliance level, that the entire page has to be conformant, that the complete process or complete transaction associated with something needs to be conformant, that you have this concept of accessibility supported, which means, hey, it actually has to work in assistive technology. And then you also have a concept of non-interference, which basically means you can't break the assistive technology, if you will, that's using the page. And so those conformance requirements, they are not in the success criteria, so a lot of times they get ignored, but they very much do relate to things that have real meaningful impact in the practical, like real world meaningful impact for people with disabilities, and they are very much covered under the actual Section 508, revised Section 508 standards. So just be aware, you should be familiar with the compliance requirements, and you want to understand how those are applicable. Outside of that, there is this little bit of flexibility for electronic content. So when you have electronic documents, you have this concept that you have these exceptions, multiple ways, bypass blocks, consistent navigation. There's consistent links and then consistent navigation. You have consistent navigation twice. And so there are some minor changes for that. A couple that are baby ones just to be aware of. Keyboard interface support is required even if you're on a mobile device. That's a little funky, but there are good reasons for that. So that is the case under WCAG. Therefore, that is the case under the revised 508 standards. You are not, however, required to make any sort of formal compliance claims as part of this. The way that you document this, the way you go to market with this, you still have a lot of control and approach over. And then finally, you may just want to make yourself familiar with what are called sufficient techniques and documented failures. So success criteria is the requirement, sufficient techniques, ways you can meet the requirements, documented failures, known ways that the requirements are violated. So wrap up a little bit on the functional performance criteria and then dig into testing approach. So as we mentioned before, functional performance requirements only apply in situations where a technology standard or guideline does not exist, or you're trying to use some equivalent manner to meet the standards and you need to validate that that equivalent manner works. So either there isn't a technical requirement for what you're trying to do, or you're doing something sort of new and funky, and you're trying to make sure that the new and funky thing that you're doing basically actually will work under the standards. And so that's kind of this concept of functional conformance. As I mentioned before, theoretically that creates a safe harbor where you have something that's technically conformant but not usable. Practically, we doubt that that's the case. You did also have some tweaks to those functional performance criteria to make them a little more clearer. So one of the functional performance criteria is with limited vision, where a visual mode of operation is provided. ICT shall provide at least one mode of operation that enables users to make use of limited vision. Slightly more clear than the prior requirement, which had to do with visual acuity and got into a whole bunch of sort of tests and requirements that weren't really relevant to does it work for a particular class of people. A couple new functional performance criteria that go into the revised 508 standards. One has to do with the perception of color, so make sure it works for people that can't perceive color. Another has to do with limited manipulation, so make sure it works for people that don't have fine motor control or can't execute simultaneous operations. Keyboard command chords are a good example of that, right, where you do Control-Alt-X. Don't require that mode of operation, right? Allow people to do Control and then Alt and then X. With limited reach and strength, ensure that it works for people that have limited degrees of reach and then also limited strength to be able to move things. And then we thought this one was really cool, limited language, cognitive, and learning abilities, right? So having some requirement in there for cognitive limitations in individuals, not just a limited cognitive function, but also language and learning abilities as well. And essentially making sure that it functions at a simple and easy level for individuals, which makes sense in the context of the product. So that's a quick wrap-up of the standards, and then we'll dig into testing and monitoring and be done. So almost always where we start off with testing is how do I determine if something is in fact compliant or conformant? And essentially validating the code of the application in some sort of intelligent fashion. And at the biggest picture level, you've got two types of testing. You got technical testing and you got functional testing. Technical testing is I look at the code of the thing and I'm trying to determine if it conforms to the relevant technical standards. And as we mentioned before, in this case, almost always that's going to be the WCAG standards. That contrasts with functional testing, where the functional testing is, does it work for people with disabilities? Ultimately, does it work in assistive technologies when those assistive technologies are being used by representative members of our user block? And so the key issue with technical testing is it's really about the individual trees, whereas functional testing is really about, like, does the system as a whole actually work? So it's about the forest. And so we would strongly recommend you do both types of testing and get information back about both the individual low-level technical conformance as well as the high-level functional testing. as I mentioned before, there is a theoretical approach here where you could just do technical conformance testing, and if you pass the technical conformance testing, you would be considered conformant. We would tell you that for a bunch of reasons, particularly the reasons relating to how you make WCAG conformance claims, that's probably not the safest approach. The safest approach is to use a mixed approach. Technical testing then breaks down into two sub-buckets. Automated testing. Essentially, automated testing is what a computer can test for automatically. And broadly speaking, that's 25% of your overall accessibility testing requirements. You can do automated testing on a page. You can do it on a website, right? So you can test an individual page. You can crawl a site. You can use a monitoring approach for a site as well. All that stuff sort of in that bucket of testing. Best case testing for automated, the testing should run on top of a browser, and you're testing what is the actual final rendered document object model in the browser. So don't have a tool that does static source code review. That's not a good automated test. Almost all of the really good automated tests, ours included, will run at the browser level and basically test the actual final render DOM. Manual tests, stuff that a human has to validate. This basically reviews sort of the code level implementation. Classic manual tests, test the functionality from the keyboard, right? Does it work from the keyboard? That knocks out a lot of stuff. You can look at API export information and basically validate things that way. But it's really getting in and qualitatively evaluating a lot of the alternatives and the experience to say, hey, does this meet particular success criteria?
Tim, we did have a
I think,
question.
KG had a question. Yeah, are both modes required by the regulation? Broadly speaking, I would tell you technical testing is a hard requirement of the regulations. Like, that is hard and fast. You absolutely have to do that. Functional testing, it's a little fuzzier. I think if you're looking for a really strict interpretation, the answer is no, you wouldn't have to do functional testing if you could justify that the technical testing fully covered the WCAG requirements, and that allowed you to make a compliance claim. The caveat on that is the WCAG conformance requirements require what is called accessibility supported. So they require that you do things in a fashion that is actually supported by assistive technologies. And so the only real way to get that past that barrier in the conformance requirements is to actually have it tested in assistive technologies. So I think, what we would tell you is the safest route is to do both, but the stuff that you absolutely have to do is technical testing, and you have a little more flexibility on functional testing. And it may be that, I think, bigger picture from a testing budget perspective, you would probably invest a great deal less in functional testing than you would in technical testing. Mika was asking, please clarify if 508 law applies to private companies if they are not receiving grants or funding from the government. The answer to that is no, it does not apply. The 508 law only applies to the federal government directly, and some states have adopted it. The short version on that is basically if a private company is trying to sell to the federal government, then while the law doesn't apply to sell things to the federal government can only buy things that are compliant. So while you're not covered under the law, you would need to sell things to them that are applicable. If you're not covered under 508 and you're public, but you have publicly available services, there are a bunch of other laws that may apply. It would really depend on the individual business. And I can dig into those too when we get into Q&A session in a little more depth. Question then on in terms of how do we test this stuff, right? So testing approach, bunch of testing tools that are out there. Automated, manual, functional testing. If you want one platform that does sort of all of it, there's a bunch out there. We provide one called AMP. Bunch of competitors out there that provide other platforms as well, but basically you can buy sort of an integrated accessibility testing platform. I am biased because the company that I work for manufactures an integrated accessibility testing platform, so I would tell you that's a good way to go, but right, you obviously don't have to do that. There are some free tools that are available to do this, we also manufacture a free tool. You can get it on webaccessibility.com. You can search for other ones online. The biggest challenges of free tools is they tend not to integrate very well into the enterprise development life cycle that you have. And so essentially, you can have some data that you sit there and you're pressing a button to diagnose a page, but it doesn't really do the automated testing particularly well, doesn't do any of the manual testing, and then doesn't integrate with development systems. Outside of that, though, in terms of actually digging in manual testing tools, there's a bunch of color contrast checkers that are out there. We like those. They tend to work pretty well, and for validating color contrast, those can be very useful. There's also a tool called Inspect 32 that ships with, I think it's the Microsoft Accessibility API or maybe UI automation. But basically, as part of an SDK available from Microsoft, you can actually get this thing called Inspect 32. That's actually a really good tool for digging in and seeing what is coming out of accessibility APIs. And then the final one is functional testing tools. That's kind of a classic approach where you use an assistive technology to test things. So quick detour as we talk about testing, which is how does information flow into assistive technology, and then what do we actually care about from an accessibility testing perspective. So this is one of these like totally inaccessible images we have here. It is explained in the notes of the slide, and then I'll give you the auditory explanation of it as well. But basically the best way to think of all of this stuff is you have this application programming interface, an accessibility API, that sits between the stuff that's on the browser and what actually happens in an assistive technology. And ultimately, what we're actually trying to determine is the technical conformance of the stuff that then passes through that API. And that's a pretty deep level of thinking about it. But a lot of the questions we see come up in accessibility, like the really nitty-gritty questions, have to do with some portion of this workflow failing. And basically, there's sort of 3 layers of this that we like. And again, this is an oversimplification, but I'd say let's run with it for now. So on the left-hand side of this, you have what is called the user agent. It's basically like a browser. And so the browser has the document object model, which basically takes HTML from the server, it takes images from the server, it takes CSS from the server, it takes all this data from the server. It takes some of those UI components, right, the images, and it basically builds out this tree that lives in memory, and that tree has these individual document elements. And then there's a layer that sits on top of that, which is JavaScript, generally speaking, and that then controls and modifies the document object model over time, right? So basically, as things happen on the page, we go in and we change that in-memory representation of the tree. And so then as things happen, we react to it and change this sort of tree. So a good way to think of that left-hand chunk is that, again, it's this tree. And really what you're trying to do at a fundamental level when you test for accessibility is make sure that that tree is valid and make sure that that tree conforms to the WCAG requirements. And so the idea there is automated and manual testing. That's the stuff that's really looking at that tree. And it's basically saying, hey, look, is the tree valid? Does it conform to these WCAG conformance requirements? Another way that you can look at that tree is what, as you go through the tree and inspect individual elements, you can actually look at what information is being sent over to assistive technology. So like as you're using JAWS, if you will, and you go through a web page, you're basically like browsing through that tree in an auditory fashion. So that middle layer, the accessibility API, can let you empirically determine what is actually present in the tree and is the information moving through. And so that gives you a couple chunks of information. One is a role, which tells you what type of widget is this. Are there any navigational landmarks there? One is states and properties. A state is, is the checkbox checked? Is the checkbox checked? Is the checkbox not checked? Wow, that is difficult to say. Properties, is this active? Is it inactive, et cetera? And that's then provided for all the various different elements that are on the page. There's hierarchy associated with that as well, parent-child relationships, and then there are events, which are things that are happening on the page. And so the concept here is that you can do your technical testing just on the tree, which is that document object model. You can do your functional testing just on the assistive technology. And then the thing that connects those two things together is the API. And so the tools then give you the ability to look into the various different components of that. Further on this aside, because hopefully it's helpful, you have two really key accessibility APIs, which are those things that sit in the middle. The historic one is called Microsoft Active Accessibility API, and you'll see it referred to as MSAA. MSAA is a set of COM components, basically component object model things in interfaces. And it basically just gives you a way to expose accessibility information. And you'll see this is like the default for most accessibility information out there. And it basically gives you four really key things: role, name, value, state. Role is what kind of object is this, like it's a button or a table. Name is essentially the label for the element, right? So the name of a form control is the label of the form control, et cetera. Value is what information is in this. So value for a slider bar is the 1 to 100 value. Value for an editable text box is the information inside the text box. And then finally, state is the current condition of the control, right? So checked or unchecked, selected, focused, et cetera. And so that's kind of one of your core APIs. And then more recently, we've had Microsoft User Interface Automation, or UI Automation, UAI, that's then built on top of that and extended on that. And so this then is the successor to MSAA and basically lets you have more extensive control over that experience. And you can actually get in and modify and edit a lot of that experience a little bit more effectively. And it's basically just a much richer approach for that. So then one of my favorite tools is Inspect32, and the fact that I have a favorite tool for testing accessibility probably speaks to the fact that I need some more hobbies. But this is actually bundled with a SDK that is provided by Microsoft, and it actually allows you to see exactly what is being exported into assistive technology. And it's really useful in terms of testing things and determining where things are at in terms of compliance. So with that aside done, then a couple notes on testing approaches. So for testing approaches, technical testing, it tends to really boil down to you diagnose individual pages, and then you do some additional checklist testing on top of that. This is where tooling, stuff like AMP, can be pretty powerful and useful because it basically just guides this whole process for you. The big approaches we see for testing of pages, right, put a URL in. You can then diagnose or scan the page, have an individual page, diagnose it in a browser plugin. So again, a lot of plugins out there. We make some. Other folks in the market make some as well. So you can diagnose it that way. There's also some ability to launch unit tests to do testing in continuous integration environments. The big thing with automated testing is you got to review the results, and you got to be wary of false positives. So automated testing tools will throw back like thousands of issues at you, and a lot of those issues will simply not be relevant accessibility issues. So you got to be pretty comfortable training the tool, if you will, to ignore certain issues, and then over time they get to be pretty good. Most of the time people do do technical testing and automated testing at development time. So it tends to be that you hand the automated testing tool to developers, and prior to code check-in, they need to go and review those things to make sure they've addressed all the automated issues. That tends to actually be a pretty good best practice we see. In addition, then, you layer on top of that technical testing with, layer on top of the automated testing, manual testing. Manual testing, generally speaking, is you take a page, you diagnose it in the browser. You can also do manual code review, so you can look at the DOM or you can look at the actual source code of the page. And essentially, you have a checklist you run through. Ideally, that checklist is integrated into a browser environment. So you have sort of a checklist in a toolbar, and you're going through it saying, this conforms, this doesn't conform. That's the approach that we use. We think it's really efficient and good. You can do it with Excel checklists. It's just a painful process to do it that way. And most of the time we see manual testing happening at QA time. If you do decide you want to layer on functional testing, which we like, the process for that's pretty straightforward. Essentially, you define use cases, and a use case is a step-by-step instruction for performing a task. It's basically, hey, here's how we log into the application, right? We go to the home page, we find a field named email, we put in our email, etc. So that's a use case. What are you trying to accomplish? We hand those use cases to individuals with disabilities using representative assistive technologies, and we basically say, can you do this thing, right? Can you log into the application? If you can, great. Give it a score. Tell us how was your experience and anything you would want to improve in it. If you can't, tell us where you had blockers. And then we implement on that and iterate on it. You can use lots of assistive technology types to do this. Most of the time we see assistive technology testing in JAWS, Zoom Text, Dragon Naturally Speaking. Occasionally we see on-screen keyboards as well and some switches. The only note I would give you a caution on this is be careful to differentiate between personal preferences and things that are needed accessibility solutions, right? So a user may come back to you and say, I didn't like X, and that may not be a compliance issue. That may be a personal preference issue. In the same vein, they may be able to work around something that doesn't actually work on the page, right? So they're using some techniques they have to get around things that are broken that really should be accessibility issues. A couple things to think about when you're doing functional tests, and ideally you're getting reporting back from the users on this. These are also things that tend to be stuff that you check in manual testing as well, so it's kind of a good exhaustive list for that. So one is just consistency. So are you using visual elements, functional elements the same throughout the application? You know, are you labeling them the same ways, et cetera? So consistency in the application. Keyboard use, can I use it with a keyboard? Can I access all of the focusable elements from the keyboard? Can I perform the functions that are associated with those elements from the keyboard? Can I see where the keyboard focus indicator is? Is there always a visual focus indicator? Is the tab order of the application logical? So if I press the tab key, do I go from element to element in the logical and same fashion? And just be aware, like, tabbing is key. If you have shortcut keys, that's great, but if you have shortcut keys without tabbing, that doesn't make you accessible. You have to basically do both and make sure the tab order makes sense. ARIA landmarks, this is a new thing, so this is kind of on the edge, but we've seen it work pretty well in apps, so we like it. Are there appropriate ARIA landmarks throughout the page? Do you not have any orphan content, so content on the page that isn't really related to a landmark? Do the landmarks have meaningful labels, right? Do the names that you stick on them make sense? On a related basis, headings. Headings has to do with mapping the document structure to the visual structure. So do you have the appropriate hierarchy of headings? Are the headings meaningful, and do the headings actually map to major sections on the page? Grouping. Mostly grouping has to do with lists and form grouping. We can talk about form grouping when we get to forms, but basically, if you're using lists of elements, are you using properly structured lists? If you have forms that have subgroupings in them, are those properly marked up as well? Graphics, always good if you have images to provide meaningful alternative text. Forms, have you provided meaningful form control labels? Have you used some sort of validation approach to make sure that the labels are associated properly, ideally at that API level? When the form is in error, do you have proper error handling? Are the errors indicated in an accessible fashion? Is there messaging associated with that, et cetera? And then sort of any more advanced components from there. So that is a good point to take a break. We got about 2 minutes left, and I'll stick around for about 5 minutes afterward for other questions. I did see one from Laura. Is AMP available for individual purchase? So we don't have it available on an individual basis now. We are, however, moving to what is called a scope of use license. And so essentially what that means is you can license it for a particular system, and then it's covered for unlimited use under the system. So we actually have some more flexible options coming online now So if that's of interest to you, let us know. We can kind of get your pricing on that. You can also get access to some of the free functionality in AMP available through webaccessibility.com, and that site's still pretty early. We just recently launched that like a couple months ago, but we'll be cycling that pretty quickly. So you should be see cool new stuff coming out there.
Tim, why don't we jump back up to Mika's questions from the previous period. If not 508, what laws apply to the private sector?
So laws that apply to the private sector, the easiest answer to that is, generally speaking, the ADA requirements will apply to private sector entities. There is a lot of complication in terms of how that happens, but if you fall under the definition of a public accommodation under the ADA requirements, then essentially the ADA requirements apply. It's really complicated how all that works. So ultimately the answer is it depends on the industry that you're in, and it depends on the nature of the assets that you have. Like what do the things do?
And then how does that impact WCAG in terms of how it is upheld in corporations?
It doesn't really change anything. The biggest difference is that there are no technical regulations for how the ADA applies to the Internet. It is all a matter of the likelihood of litigation under the ADA. And so it becomes much more an issue of legal strategy than it does of conforming to a very specific technical standard.
Okay, and then we had Mika ask again, for videos, is it sufficient to provide caption? Is it required to have both captions and transcriptions needed for videos?
You know, I don't remember. I hate to tell you that because it's better if I just know that off the top of my head. I believe captions do it, but we would tell you to provide transcripts. I think providing the transcripts is optional. I think it's a AAA requirement, but the answer is I don't remember. And you can always email me afterwards, and I'll get you a more intelligent answer on that. But I think big picture, assume that captions are required, transcripts are optional. Transcripts are really less the primary concern. To be honest, the primary concern is audio description. And do you have to provide audio description? And you are required to provide audio description under WCAG requirements. And so that's a new shift.
Then one more from Mika. Can ARIA be used for mobile app, non-web applications?
Generally speaking, if it is a native mobile app, we would recommend that you use the native operating system component. If it is a mobile app that is using HTML to render the interface, then yes, you can definitely use ARIA for it. But yeah, if it's a native app, use the underlying native operating system accessibility calls. If it's rendered using HTML, then yeah, definitely use ARIA.
Demina asked, is there a planned date of release for the new VPAT template?
I'm sure there is. I don't know what it is. My guess is that IC is probably hanging out for a little bit as they get that. But yeah, my guess is they'll have some sort of release date. The challenge is that the government hasn't really gone through the process of saying what they want to do. And the VPAT is a joint government-private sector development. So it's really going to depend on what the GSA wants to do. And the GSA is, I think, may show an appetite to go a slightly different way with this 508 standard, but we'll see.
And then UCF asked, do you offer a type of training for non-technical users?
So we at Level Access / SSB Bar Group do, and it just kind of depends what the right audience is. But broadly speaking, there's sort of three levels of accessibility training, if you will. There's kind of the super general digital accessibility is important training, right? That's kind of like your half-hour security training we all get. There's the more detailed 1-hour manager level training, which is around really budgeting time and resources for accessibility. And then there's really detailed technical training at the base of that pyramid. I also had seen earlier, Kevin, a question from KG on, with the current political environment focus on deregulation, can you speculate on potential impacts to the compliance date in January 2018? Big picture, we don't think it's really going to change. And the answer there is really based on the fact that it's not a law that applies to business. And so the current stated approach of the administration is to remove regulation that's relevant to business. And since 508 is not relevant to business, it's just relevant to the government, we think it actually goes through. We actually would argue that in this space, regulation would probably be good for business, but independent of that stance, yeah, our current view is it doesn't change anything, and that it's really just a pro forma thing. And essentially the due date for actually making any changes was 2 days ago. So it's past the point at which the regulation is effective at this point. Sure. All right. Well, it looks like that's it. So, Kevin, you want to take us out?
Sure. Thank you very much, Tim. This was a fantastic presentation, very informative, very in-depth. There you can see some contact information from Tim, so I'll give everyone a few seconds to copy that down if you would like. I'd also like to thank our captionist for providing the captioning for this session. Normally we will have a transcript available of that as well. And then I also want to direct you to our feedback survey. If you have any thoughts, questions, or concerns about the webinar, please feel free to visit the survey link listed here. And you should also receive that in an email soon. And then I just wanted to also announce that we have some more upcoming webinars. On Thursday, April 20th, from 11 to 12:30 Eastern, we will have the accessible design for an aging population. And then on Wednesday, May 24th, again 11 a.m. to 12:30 Eastern, we will have accessibility legislation in Europe, standards, laws, and how to interpret them. So again, we will send out an email with the link to the recording as well as the survey. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you again to Tim, and we hope to see you next time.
Bye.